The telephone at Wehrmacht headquarters began ringing at precisely 11:47 in the evening on June 5, 1944. The duty officer, a competent but unremarkable major whose name history has forgotten, answered with practiced efficiency. The voice on the other end belonged to an intelligence analyst at Army Group B headquarters, speaking with the clipped urgency of someone delivering information they knew was critical. Reconnaissance aircraft had detected unusual activity along the English Channel coast. Radio intercepts had picked up increased Allied communications traffic. Resistance sabotage operations across France had suddenly intensified in coordinated patterns. Weather conditions, previously unfavorable for amphibious operations, were showing a brief window of improvement. All indicators pointed toward an imminent invasion. The major documented the report, assigned it an appropriate classification, and initiated the standard notification protocols. Within 20 minutes, the information had reached the relevant commands. Within 40 minutes, German coastal defenses had been placed on heightened alert. Within an hour, senior officers were discussing response options should the invasion materialize. Yet the one person who most needed this information, the Supreme Commander whose decisions would determine Germany's response to the most significant military operation in history, remained undisturbed in his bedroom at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in Bavaria, sleeping peacefully while the fate of his empire hung in balance. Adolf Hitler had established peculiar working habits that reflected his contempt for military convention and his absolute confidence in his own strategic genius. He kept irregular hours, often staying awake until 3 or 4 in the morning discussing philosophy, architecture, and politics with his inner circle, then sleeping until midday or later. His staff had learned through bitter experience that disturbing his sleep invited explosions of rage that could derail operations for hours and end careers instantly. Standing orders specified that Hitler was not to be awakened for any reason short of direct attack on German territory. Intelligence reports, battlefield developments, even urgent operational decisions requiring Supreme Commander approval could wait until he chose to emerge from his chambers. This arrangement struck professional military officers as insane, a fundamental violation of command responsibility that subordinated military necessity to one man's preference for uninterrupted rest. Yet none dared challenge the protocol. Those who had questioned Hitler's methods were dead, dismissed, or commanding insignificant sectors where their opinions carried no weight. The night of June 5th into June 6th was not unusual by the standards Hitler had established. He had spent the evening at the Berghof entertaining guests, discussing his plans for post-war reconstruction of German cities, and screening a film. He retired sometime after 2 in the morning, giving instructions that he was not to be disturbed before noon. His personal staff settled into their own routines, secure in the knowledge that their primary duty was managing access to the Führer rather than ensuring he received time-critical information. The entire command structure had adjusted itself around Hitler's schedule, accepting as normal a situation where the Supreme Commander of German armed forces was functionally unreachable for 12 hours at a time, regardless of what might be occurring on any front. Meanwhile, in Normandy, the machinery of invasion was grinding into motion with the methodical precision that characterized American military operations. Thousands of ships were positioning themselves off the French coast. Paratroopers were boarding aircraft across English airfields. Naval guns were calculating firing solutions for coastal fortifications. Combat engineers were reviewing obstacle demolition procedures one final time. Soldiers were checking equipment, writing last letters home, and trying to sleep in the pitching holds of landing craft. The largest amphibious operation in military history was entering its final hours of preparation, timed to exploit that narrow window of acceptable weather that meteorologists had identified, scheduled to the minute through planning that had consumed months of intensive staff work. The invasion would begin whether Hitler was awake to respond or not. German commanders in France understood what was coming with growing clarity as the night progressed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B responsible for coastal defense, was ironically away from his headquarters, having traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and hoping to speak with Hitler personally about reinforcement needs. His absence on this particular night was coincidental rather than planned, the sort of random chance that shapes history as much as strategic brilliance. But his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was present and fully aware that the indicators pointed toward imminent invasion. Speidel had access to the same intelligence reports, the same reconnaissance summaries, the same pattern analysis that had reached Wehrmacht headquarters. He understood the implications perfectly well. Yet, the command structure that might have enabled rapid German response was paralyzed by competing authorities, ambiguous orders, and the Supreme Commander's unavailability. The German military had become dysfunctional through years of Hitler's interference in operational matters and his insistence on personal control of strategic decisions. Authority was fragmented across competing commands. The Luftwaffe answered to Göring, the SS answered to Himmler. The Navy maintained its own chain of command, and the Wehrmacht itself was split between various theater commands with overlapping jurisdictions. Critical resources, particularly panzer divisions that represented Germany's only hope of throwing back an invasion, could not be moved without authorization from the highest levels. Theater commanders could request permission to deploy reserves, but actual release orders had to come from OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, which meant in practice they required Hitler's personal approval. This system ensured that no subordinate commander could launch a coup by seizing control of military forces, but it also meant that rapid response to developing situations was impossible without the Supreme Commander's direct involvement. As dawn approached on June 6th, the situation along the Norman coast was transitioning from ominous indicators to confirmed reality. Paratroopers were landing across the countryside, some on target, many scattered by weather and navigation errors, but all creating chaos in German rear areas. Allied aircraft were conducting massive bombardment operations. Naval gunfire was beginning to impact coastal defenses. German coastal observation posts were reporting ships massing offshore in numbers that exceeded anything in their experience. Local commanders were engaging paratroopers, calling for reinforcements, attempting to organize defenses according to existing plans. Yet the critical decision about deploying operational reserves, about committing the panzer divisions that might have crushed the invasion while it was most vulnerable, remained unmade because the person authorized to make that decision was asleep in Bavaria. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander in the West, understood that hours mattered. Every moment the panzers remained immobile was a moment that Allied forces used to strengthen their beachhead positions, to bring more troops ashore, to establish supply lines and communications networks. German doctrine emphasized counterattacking amphibious landings immediately, hitting invasion forces while they were disorganized and vulnerable before they could consolidate. Von Rundstedt had the military experience to know what needed to happen. He had the authority to request panzer deployment. He did not have the authority to actually order the deployment without approval from above. So he requested. And he waited. And the hours of darkness that might have concealed German armor movements slipped away while the Supreme Commander slept. Hitler's staff faced an impossible dilemma. Standing orders said, "Do not wake him." Military necessity screamed that this was exactly the sort of situation that required Supreme Commander involvement. Yet who would take responsibility for violating the standing orders? Who would face Hitler's rage when he discovered he had been awakened? The psychology of totalitarian systems creates paralysis in subordinates who understand that any initiative might be punished as insubordination. Hitler had cultivated an atmosphere where personal loyalty to him mattered more than professional competence, where following orders precisely was safer than exercising judgment. His staff had been selected for obedience rather than independence. Now that selection criteria resulted in a situation where multiple officers knew the Supreme Commander needed to be informed of the invasion, but none were willing to make the decision to wake him. Finally, sometime around 10 in the morning, on June 6th, with the invasion 6 hours old and Allied forces firmly ashore on 5 beaches, with thousands of ships visible off the Norman coast and airborne divisions operating across the countryside, Hitler's staff made the decision that the situation had developed sufficiently that the Führer should be informed. They woke him. They briefed him on the situation as it had evolved overnight and through the morning. They presented the requests from theater commanders for permission to deploy panzer reserves. And Hitler, emerging from sleep to learn that the invasion he had expected for months had actually occurred while he slept, made a series of decisions that demonstrated why his personal involvement in operational matters was so destructive. Hitler's initial response was skepticism. He questioned whether this was the main invasion or merely a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas de Calais, where he remained convinced the real invasion would occur. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable given Allied deception operations that had been designed specifically to reinforce German assumptions about Calais. But it meant that at the critical moment when rapid commitment of reserves might have made a difference, Hitler was hesitating, second-guessing his field commanders, imposing delays while he evaluated the situation according to his own strategic theories. Hours more slipped away while Hitler conducted his personal analysis. When he finally authorized movement of panzer divisions toward Normandy, it was midday on June 6th. The divisions would require hours to move into position. They would be moving in daylight, exposed to Allied air power that ruled the skies. They would be arriving after the critical window had closed, after Allied forces had time to dig in, to establish artillery positions, to coordinate defenses. The consequences of Hitler's sleep extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The delay in committing reserves meant that when panzer divisions finally engaged Allied forces, they did so piecemeal rather than in coordinated mass, attacking positions that had been reinforced rather than vulnerable beachheads, operating under air superiority conditions that made daylight movement suicidal. German counterattacks, which might have been devastating if launched in darkness during the first hours of the invasion, instead became grinding attrition battles, where German armor advantages were negated by Allied firepower and air support. The opportunity to throw the invasion back into the sea, if such an opportunity ever realistically existed, had certainly vanished by the time Hitler's delayed authorization reached frontline units. Yet the deeper significance of Hitler's sleep was not merely tactical, but systemic. It revealed how completely the German command structure had subordinated military effectiveness to the whims of one individual. A professional military organization would have had clear chains of command, delegated authority for time-critical decisions, and protocols ensuring that supreme commanders remained informed of developing situations. The German military in 1944 had none of these things because Hitler had systematically dismantled them, centralizing all significant decisions in his own hands while simultaneously making himself unavailable for large portions of each day. The result was a command system that could not respond rapidly to unexpected developments, that paralyzed initiative at lower levels, and that ensured tactical opportunities would be missed while awaiting authorization from the top. German officers who survived the war would spend decades analyzing what went wrong in Normandy, debating whether earlier commitment of reserves might have defeated the invasion, arguing about the relative importance of Allied air superiority, logistical advantages, and numerical strength. These debates missed the fundamental point that Germany had created a military system where the supreme commander could sleep through the opening hours of the most important battle of the war and no one could do anything about it. The technical details of defensive positions, armor deployments, and tactical responses mattered far less than the structural dysfunction that made responsive command impossible. The night of June 5, 1944, was not the first time Hitler's command style had imposed costs on German military operations. It would not be the last. But it was perhaps the most consequential single instance where his personal habits directly affected operational outcomes at a strategic level. While Hitler slept, the course of the war was being determined by Allied forces landing on Norman beaches, by German coastal defenders fighting without reserves or clear orders, by staff officers afraid to make decisions that might later be second-guessed, by a command system that had sacrificed military effectiveness for political control. The Allies won the Normandy invasion through superior resources, better planning, overwhelming firepower, and systematic execution. But Germany lost it, in part because, when the invasion came, the one person who had insisted on controlling every significant decision was asleep, unreachable, and surrounded by subordinates too terrified of his anger to wake him until the battle was already 6 hours old. History does not turn on single moments or individual decisions in the dramatic way that popular narratives suggest. The outcome of the Second World War was determined by industrial capacity, resource availability, strategic geography, and the cumulative effect of thousands of tactical engagements. Hitler's sleep on June 5th changed nothing fundamental about these underlying realities. Allied material superiority would have prevailed regardless of when Hitler woke or what decisions he made about panzer deployments. Yet, within that broader context of inevitable Allied victory, the specific events of June 5th and 6th demonstrated with perfect clarity the pathology of Germany's command system and the price paid for subordinating military professionalism to totalitarian control. When Hitler finally emerged from his bedroom on June 6th and learned that the invasion had come while he slept, he did not acknowledge error or accept responsibility for the command paralysis his sleeping orders had created. Instead, he blamed his generals for not being more aggressive, criticized their tactical decisions, and continued to insist on personal control of operational details while remaining unavailable for half of each day. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position apparently never troubled him. He had created a system where he monopolized authority but could not be reached during crises, where subordinates were punished for showing initiative but also blamed for not acting decisively, where military necessity was subordinated to his personal schedule, yet defeats were attributed to others' failures. The full scope of what Allied forces had achieved became clear over the following days as reconnaissance reports reached German headquarters. The scale of the invasion fleet dwarfed anything Germany could have assembled. The logistical infrastructure being established on the beaches exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. The air supremacy situation made German daytime operations virtually impossible. The material abundance of Allied forces contrasted sharply with German supply shortages. Every indicator suggested that Germany faced an opponent operating at resource levels that made conventional defensive strategies inadequate. Yet Hitler continued to issue orders based on assumptions that tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage, that German soldiers could achieve through willpower what they lacked in support and supplies, that the invasion could still be thrown back through determined counterattacks. The tragedy for German soldiers fighting in Normandy was that they performed with the skill and courage that Hitler's rhetoric demanded, yet found themselves ground down by an operational system that wasted their effectiveness through poor command decisions, delayed responses, and strategic rigidity. They held positions longer than should have been possible, given their material disadvantages. They launched counterattacks against overwhelming odds. They adapted to impossible situations with the professionalism that came from years of combat experience. Yet, none of this could overcome the fundamental dysfunction of a command system where the supreme commander could sleep through the opening of the decisive battle while his subordinates waited helplessly for authorization to respond. June 5, 1944, was the night when Hitler's command style, his contempt for military convention, his insistence on personal control combined with personal unavailability, crystallized into consequences that could be measured in hours lost, opportunities missed, and battles decided before they were fully joined. It was the night when the gap between Hitler's image of himself as military genius and the reality of his destructive interference in operations became too obvious to ignore, even for those who had previously made excuses for his methods. It was the night when Germany's last realistic chance to disrupt the Allied invasion in its vulnerable first hours slipped away, while the man who had insisted on controlling every significant military decision slept peacefully, unreachable and undisturbed, until long after the critical moment had passed. The invasion of Normandy succeeded for many reasons. Allied planning was thorough. Allied resources were overwhelming. Allied execution was professional. German defenses were undermined by competing authorities, insufficient reserves, and impossible strategic positions. But among all the factors that determined the outcome, one stands out for its sheer absurdity. That when the most important military operation of the war began, the German Supreme Commander was asleep, and no one in the entire command structure was willing to wake him until the battle was already lost.